The living things in an ecosystem are made up of chemicals and use energy. So far in our unit, we've seen how energy flows through an ecosystem from solar energy to chemical energy, and then how much of it is lost as heat to the environment. In this video, we are now going to focus on chemicals and how chemicals are cycled through an ecosystem. Let's start by talking about the importance of chemical cycles. Well, it should be pretty obvious, but given that living things are made up of chemicals, in order to survive, living things have to obtain those chemicals from somewhere, and chemical cycles are the method by which living things obtain the chemicals that make them up. What are these chemicals that we find in living things? Well, the most commonly found elements are hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And then there are trace amounts of these chemicals. However, you won't find these chemicals in their elemental form in living things. You'll usually find these chemicals bonded to other chemicals to make up larger molecules. For example, nucleotides in DNA contain carbon, phosphorus, hydrogen, nitrogen. Glucose molecules contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Fatty acids contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the amino acids of proteins contain all of those, plus the very important nitrogen. Again, where do living things get these chemicals? Well, they get them from the environment. And in the environment, they're usually found in an inorganic form. Remember that inorganic means not having carbon and hydrogen. So we'll find these chemicals in the atmosphere, in the soil, or even in water. How do these chemicals get from the abiotic part of the ecosystem into living things? Well, it's usually producers that are going to convert the inorganic chemicals into organic chemicals for living things. And in this video, we're going to explore how producers do that for carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Let's start with the one you're most familiar with, the carbon cycle. So in its inorganic form, carbon starts as carbon dioxide. But then plants will take in carbon dioxide, and through the process of photosynthesis, they'll convert it into glucose. Glucose is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So this is now organic. And then animals might eat the plant, and so now the glucose ends up in consumers. And both consumers and producers will break down the glucose during the process of cellular respiration, thus returning the carbon back to the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Additionally, when living things die, decomposers like bacteria and fungi will break down the dead organisms and do cellular respiration, and again in the process give off carbon dioxide. Another part of the carbon cycle involves combustion. This is when we burn fossil fuels. Fossil fuels formed from the remains of dead things. So when we burn the remains of dead things, we also give off carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So you can see that matter is being conserved. The carbon is just moving from one form, the inorganic carbon dioxide, into another form, the organic carbohydrate. And here's a summary of that information. So now let's look at the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen starts off in the atmosphere in the form of a nitrogen molecule, two nitrogen atoms bonded together. Now this is not usable to living things in this form, but fortunately there are bacteria in the soil that will take that nitrogen and they will convert it into a more usable form, usually nitrates. Then nitrates can be taken in by plants, and plants will turn that into organic materials, for example, amino acids found in proteins. And then animals may consume the plants, and so now animals have nitrogen-containing compounds. And then eventually, when the animals and the plants and other consumers die, the decomposers will return the nitrogen back into inorganic materials. So again, nitrogen is not being created or destroyed, it's just moving from one form, inorganic nitrogen, inorganic ammonium, inorganic nitrate, into other forms like organic amino acids. And here's a summary of that information. Finally, the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus starts off in the form of phosphate in rocks. And due to the process of weathering, the rocks will slowly break down and become soil phosphates. This can then be taken in by plants, and plants will convert the inorganic phosphate into, for example, the phosphate found in DNA. Here's a nucleotide with a phosphate, a sugar, and a base. And then animals may consume the plants, and now the organic molecule is in animals. And then when plants and animals die, decomposers will convert that phosphate back into its inorganic form, and the cycle can begin again. So again, phosphorus, this element right here, is simply being converted from an inorganic form, phosphate, into organic forms like nucleotides of DNA. And here's a summary of that information. So to close out, all of these cycles had a few elements in common. We start off with an abiotic reservoir. This is some component of the ecosystem where the chemicals are stored in inorganic form. It could be phosphates in the soil, nitrogen and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or carbon dioxide in water. And the next step is that plants will take in those inorganic chemicals and convert them into organic forms. The technical term for this is assimilation. Then we have consumers that consume the producers, and then the consumers may give off some waste, which returns the chemicals back to the reservoir. The consumers and the producers will eventually die, and the decomposers will break them down. That will also return the chemicals to the reservoir. And that concludes our exploration of how chemicals are recycled in an ecosystem.